Today, I'm sharing 5 phrases that completely shifted the power dynamic in every room I walk into. And here's the thing, these words aren't aggressive, they're not manipulative, and you won't find them in typical self-help books. These are ancient Stoic phrases that I tested for 30 days in the most challenging situations, boardrooms, difficult conversations, even family drama, and the results genuinely shocked me. I know some of you are thinking sounds like clickbait, but stay with me, because what I'm about to share isn't theory. These are battle-tested words that changed how my boss speaks to me, how strangers respond to me, and most importantly, how I see myself. Whether you're constantly interrupted, talked over, or feel invisible in conversations, these 5 phrases will fundamentally alter your presence. So here's what's happening today. I'm breaking down each phrase, showing you exactly when to use it, sharing the uncomfortable moments when I almost chickened out, and revealing what happened when I finally committed to speaking like a Stoic philosopher. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll have a completely different understanding of what real respect looks like, and how ridiculously simple it is to command it without raising your voice once. So let's get into it. The first phrase is, "Help me understand your reasoning, and I'll be straight with you." I discovered this by accident during a meeting where someone was steamrolling my ideas. My old response would have been getting defensive, raising my voice, trying to out-argue them. Instead, something made me pause and say, "Help me understand your reasoning behind that approach," and the entire room went silent. Here's what made this phrase devastating in the best way possible. When you ask someone to explain their reasoning, you're not arguing, you're not agreeing, you're doing something far more powerful. You're forcing them to actually think. And here's the secret. Most people who try to dominate conversations haven't thought through their position. They're running on ego, not logic. The Stoics, especially. Socrates before them knew that the question is mightier than the statement Epictetus taught his students. If someone tried to intimidate you, ask them to teach you to explain their wisdom. This flips the power dynamic instantly because now they have to justify themselves to you. I'll never forget using this with a contractor who was trying to overcharge me for work. He threw out this inflated quote, expecting me to either pay or argue. Instead, I said, "Help me understand your reasoning for this price point. What specifically justifies this cost?" The guy fumbled. He stuttered suddenly, his confidence evaporated because he couldn't justify it, and within minutes the price dropped by 40%. What shocked me most was how calm I felt using this phrase. There was no adrenaline, no anger, just curiosity. And somehow that curiosity was more intimidating than any argument I could have made. People respect those who seek to understand, not those who seek to dominate. And this phrase positions you as the intelligent one, the reasonable one. I started using it everywhere. Someone criticizes my work. "Help me understand your reasoning." Someone makes a sweeping political statement. "Help me understand your reasoning." Someone tries to guilt-trip me into something. "Help me understand your reasoning behind asking me to do this." And almost always, one of 2 things happens. They either provide legitimate reasoning, which actually helps me learn, or they realize they don't have any, and they back down. The genius of this phrase is, it's impossible to argue against. You're literally asking to learn. Who can get mad at that? But what you're really doing is calling their bluff. You're saying, "Prove it, show your work," and most people can't. There was this moment with a family member who was pressuring me about my life choices. Instead of the usual defensive spiral, I asked, "Help me understand your reasoning. What specifically makes you think your path would work better for me?" And the conversation completely changed. They actually had to consider whether their advice was about me or about them. One thing the Stoics understood deeply is that respect comes from intellectual sovereignty. When you control the questions, you control the conversation. When you remain curious while others become emotional, you become the most powerful person in the room. This phrase is your tool for that. Start using this today. when someone challenges you, dismisses you, or tries to pressure you. And watch what happens. Most people will respect you more immediately, because you're not playing the emotional game, you're playing the intellectual one, and that's a game most people aren't prepared for. Phrase number 2 nearly broke me the first time I said it. I'm comfortable with your disappointment now. Before you think, that sounds harsh. Let me explain the context and why this phrase is perhaps the most respectful thing you can say to someone who's trying to manipulate you. I learned this phrase from studying Marcus Aurelius, who constantly reminded himself that he couldn't control other people's emotions, expectations, or reactions. The only thing he could control was his own integrity, his own choices, and this phrase embodies that perfectly. The situation was this: a friend kept asking me to cover for them at work, taking advantage of my inability to say no. Finally, after reading Meditations for the 3rd time, I realized I was sacrificing my peace for their comfort when they asked. Again, I said, I understand this disappoints you and I'm comfortable with your disappointment. The silence was deafening. Here's what this phrase really means. I acknowledge your feelings, but I'm not responsible for managing them. You're an adult. I'm an adult, and I can make choices that don't please you without being a bad person. It's the ultimate boundary statement, wrapped in complete calm. The first few times I used this, my hands were shaking because I'd spent my entire life being terrified of disappointing people. I was the yes person, the reliable one, the one who sacrificed everything to keep others happy, and this phrase felt like jumping off a cliff. But here's what happened. People didn't hate me, they respected me. I used it when my boss expected me to work weekends again. I said, I'm comfortable with your disappointment about my availability this weekend. The expectation was that I'd scramble to explain or apologize. Instead, I just let it sit there. And you know what happened? My boss said okay, and found someone else. No drama, no grudge, just acceptance. The Stoics taught that suffering comes from wanting reality to be different than it is when you say, I'm comfortable with your disappointment. You're accepting reality. Someone is disappointed. And that's okay. Disappointment isn't dangerous, it's just an emotion, and adults can handle their own emotions. I tested this phrase in romantic relationships too, when a partner tried to guilt me into cancelling plans with friends. I said, I hear that you're disappointed and I'm comfortable with that. I'm still going. It felt brutal to say, but it was honest and authentic. And it established that my choices weren't up for negotiation. What I noticed over time was that the people who truly cared about me respected this boundary. The ones who didn't were revealing themselves as manipulators who needed me to be uncomfortable so they could be comfortable. And that's not love, that's control. There was a turning point when I used this with a parent who had a lifetime pattern of emotional manipulation. When I declined a request and heard the familiar guilt trip, I calmly said, I love you and I'm comfortable with your disappointment about this choice. The relationship actually improved because I stopped participating in the dysfunction. This phrase teaches people that your emotional discomfort is not a remote control for my behavior. The Stoics knew that when you stop trying to control others' emotions, you become uncontrollable yourself. You're no longer a puppet dancing to avoid someone's disappointment. The respect this phrase commands is profound because most people are so terrified of disappointing others that they betray themselves constantly. When you demonstrate that you can tolerate someone's disappointment without crumbling, you show strength, you show self-respect, and paradoxically, you show them respect by treating them as capable of handling their own feelings. Try this phrase once this week with someone who regularly uses disappointment as a weapon. Say it calmly, say it kindly, but say it firmly, and watch how the dynamic shifts. You're not being cruel, you're being honest, and that honesty commands a respect that people-pleasing never will. The third phrase is, "That's not my experience," and this one saved me from countless pointless arguments, debates, and gaslighting attempts. It's only 5 words, but it's an impenetrable shield against people who try to tell you what your reality should be. I stumbled onto this phrase during a conversation where someone was confidently explaining to me how I felt about something. Actually, you don't really mind when people interrupt you. Everyone likes collaborative conversation. No, I said, that's not my experience. And the person just stopped. They had nowhere to go, because I wasn't arguing about objective reality. I was simply stating my subjective truth. The Stoics were brilliant about this distinction between opinion and experience. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Your experience is yours alone." And this phrase protects that sovereignty. It doesn't argue, doesn't debate, just states, "Here's my reality and it's different from yours." I started using this everywhere. Someone tells me a job is easy when I found it difficult. That's not my experience. Someone insists a restaurant is amazing when I got food poisoning there. That's not my experience. Someone claims nobody cares about an issue that deeply affected me. That's not my experience. What makes this phrase so powerful is its calm finality. You're not saying the other person is wrong. You're not invalidating their experience. You're simply standing firm in your own, and there's nothing to argue with. You can't debate someone's lived experience. It just is. There was this moment at a family gathering where a relative was minimizing something traumatic from my childhood. "Oh, it wasn't that bad. You're too sensitive. Everyone goes through that." And instead of defending myself or getting emotional, I just said, "That's not my experience," and continued eating my dinner. The conversation moved on because there was no fight to be had. I noticed that people who respect you will accept this phrase immediately. "Okay, I hear you. Your experience is different." People who don't respect you will push back, "But you're wrong. It didn't happen that way." And that's when you know you're dealing with someone who needs to control your reality, not understand it. The phrase works in professional settings too. During a project debrief, someone said the timeline was totally reasonable, and I replied, "That's not my experience. I found it extremely tight and had to sacrifice quality to meet it." Suddenly other people felt safe to agree, and the company actually changed their timelines going forward. What the Stoics understood is that your perception is your reality. When you let others define your experience for you, you lose yourself piece by piece. This phrase is about reclaiming that ground, saying, "My inner world is mine. I'm the authority on it, not you." I used this phrase during a disagreement about politics. Someone was explaining what people like me really believe, and I said, "That's not my experience of my own beliefs. Would you like to hear them? Or would you prefer to keep explaining me to myself?" The person actually laughed, admitted they were projecting, and we had a real conversation. The respect this commands comes from intellectual honesty. You're not playing games, not manipulating, not exaggerating. You're simply being the definitive expert on your own experience. And when you claim that expertise calmly and without aggression, people recognize they're in the presence of someone who knows themselves. One breakthrough moment was using this in therapy, when the therapist made an interpretation that felt completely wrong, instead of nodding along like I used to. I said respectfully, "That's not my experience," and explained what was actually happening. The quality of the sessions improved dramatically because I stopped letting the expert override my own self-knowledge. Start using this phrase when people try to tell you how you feel, what you think, or what you experienced. You don't need to argue or justify. Just calmly state, "That's not my experience," and let it stand. The people worth having in your life will respect it. The ones who don't will reveal themselves. Phrase number 4 is, "What would you do if I said no?" And I'm warning you right now, this phrase is dangerous because it exposes manipulation instantly. It forces people to confront whether they're making a request or issuing a disguised demand. I learned this from studying Stoic negotiation tactics, particularly how Marcus Aurelius dealt with the Roman Senate. When people would come to him with seemingly reasonable requests, he would often pause and ask, "What happens if I refuse?" The question revealed everything about their true intentions. The first time I used this was terrifying. A colleague asked me to cover their presentation. I'd covered for them 3 times already, and instead of automatically saying yes or making excuses, I asked, "What would you do if I said no?" The person was stunned because they'd never considered I might refuse. They'd been operating under the assumption that I was obligated, and this question shattered that assumption. Here's the brilliance of this phrase. It's not saying no, it's asking a question, but that question does something profound. It reminds both of you that you have agency, that no is an option, that you're choosing to help, not obligated to help, and that completely reframes the power dynamic. The Stoics were obsessed with understanding what's in your control versus what isn't. When someone makes a request, they're trying to control your behavior. This phrase reminds them that they can't. You're a free agent, and you're evaluating whether their request aligns with your values and capacity. I started using this with family members who would volunteer my time without asking. I'd hear plans being made for me, and I'd calmly interrupt. "What would you do if I said no to this?" Suddenly they had to acknowledge they'd been assuming, not asking. And in most cases they'd say, "Oh, well, if you can't, then we'll figure something else out," revealing that my participation wasn't actually necessary, just convenient for them. In professional settings, this phrase is nuclear. Someone implies you have to stay late. "What would you do if I said no?" Someone suggests you should take on a project outside your role. "What would you do if I said no?" The question forces them to reveal whether this is a request you can decline or a demand they're disguising as a choice. What I loved discovering was that legitimate requests survive this question. When I asked a friend, "What would you do if I said no about helping them move?" they said, honestly, "I'd be disappointed, but I'd hire movers or ask someone else." That's a real request based on mutual respect. When requests don't survive this question, when people get angry or manipulative, you've just identified a boundary violation. There was a pivotal moment with a romantic partner who would regularly volunteer us for social obligations without consulting me. When I asked, "What would you do if I said no to this dinner party?" they got defensive. "Well, I already committed, so you have to go." And I replied, "No, I don't have to. And if you committed my time without asking me, that's something we need to address." The relationship actually improved because we established real consent. The Stoics taught that freedom is not the absence of commitments, but the presence of choice. When you use this phrase, you're asserting your freedom. You're saying, "I might help you, but I'm choosing to not being forced to." And that choice is what makes the help meaningful. I used this phrase when salespeople tried to create false urgency. "This offer expires today. What would you do if I said no?" Suddenly the offer would magically extend, or a supervisor option would appear. The scarcity was manufactured, and the question called it out. One of the most powerful applications was with myself. When I felt obligated to do something, I'd ask, "What would I do if I said no?" And often I'd realize the consequences weren't as dire as I'd imagined. The world wouldn't end. People would adapt, I'd survive, and that realization was liberating. The respect this phrase commands is significant because it signals you're not a pushover, not someone who can be pressured or guilted. You're someone who makes conscious choices and who expects others to respect those choices. People learn quickly that asking you for something requires actual respect for your autonomy. Try this phrase this week. When someone asks you for something, especially if they're someone who usually assumes you'll say yes, ask genuinely, "What would you do if I said no?" and listen to their answer. It'll tell you everything you need to know about whether you're being respected or being used, and that information is priceless. The 5th phrase is, "I'm going to trust my judgment on this." And this might be the most important one, because it's the phrase that ends the debate. It's the full stop, the period at the end of the sentence, when everyone else wants to keep questioning your decisions. I discovered the power of this phrase after reading Seneca's letters, where he talks about the tyranny of other people's opinions. He wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. When you constantly defer to others' judgment, you're living in that imaginary suffering." The context was a major life decision. I was making career change, and everyone had opinions. My parents thought I was making a mistake. Friends were skeptical, colleagues thought I was crazy, and I spent weeks trying to justify my choice to all of them, until I realized I didn't owe anyone that justification. I simply said, "I appreciate your concern, and I'm going to trust my judgment on this." What happened next was revelatory. Some people respected it immediately. Others kept pushing, and when they did, I repeated it. "I hear you, and I'm going to trust my judgment on this," like a broken record, calm, unshakable, and eventually everyone stopped. Because what can you say to that? Are you really going to argue that someone shouldn't trust their own judgment? The Stoics, especially Marcus Aurelius, were adamant that you must be the author of your own life. Nobody else lives with the consequences of your choices the way you do. Nobody else lies awake at night in your head. Nobody else has access to all the variables you're considering. So why would their judgment supersede yours? I started using this in medical situations, when doctors would recommend treatments that didn't feel right. Instead of passively accepting, I'd say, "I appreciate your expertise, and I'm going to trust my judgment on this." I'd like to explore other options. This wasn't about being reckless, it was about being an active participant in my own healthcare, and doctors who were good at their job respected it. In financial decisions, when advisors would push certain investments, I'd say, "I'm going to trust my judgment on this and go with the more conservative option." The ones who respected my autonomy stayed in my life. The ones who got pushy revealed they cared more about their commission than my well-being. What makes this phrase different from just saying no is that it's about self-trust. It's not, "I don't want to." It's, "I've evaluated this, and my judgment tells me this is the right path for me." That level of self-assurance is magnetic. People respect those who trust themselves. There was a moment in a relationship where my partner wanted to move faster than I was comfortable with. When I expressed hesitation, they tried to logic me out of my feelings. "But you said you loved me. This is the natural next step. Everyone moves in together at this point." And I said, "I hear you, and I'm going to trust my judgment on this. I'm not ready." The relationship didn't survive, but that was information I needed. Someone who couldn't respect my self-trust wasn't someone I could build a life with. I used this phrase with parents who still wanted to make decisions for me. Well into my adulthood, what car I bought, where I lived, how I spent my money each time. I'd calmly say, "I'm going to trust my judgment on this." It created some tension initially, but ultimately led to a more respectful adult relationship. The Stoics knew that wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting your ability to navigate uncertainty. When you say, "I'm going to trust my judgment," you're not claiming to be infallible, you're claiming ownership of your life. And that ownership is what commands respect. One breakthrough was using this phrase with my own self-doubt. When I'd start second-guessing myself, I'd literally say out loud, "I'm going to trust my judgment on this and move forward." It stopped the spiral of indecision and analysis paralysis. I made my choice, I committed, and I dealt with whatever came. The phrase also creates accountability. When you trust your own judgment, you own the outcome. You can't blame others. You can't play victim. You become the captain of your ship, and that level of personal responsibility is rare and powerful. I'll never forget using this phrase in a high-stakes business meeting. People were pressuring me to agree to terms that felt wrong. And I simply said, "I appreciate everyone's input, and I'm going to trust my judgment on this. We need to revise these terms." Some people were frustrated, but weeks later, when my instinct proved correct, those same people came back with newfound respect. Start using this phrase when people won't respect your decisions, when they keep pushing, questioning, trying to override your choices. Say it once, say it calmly, and then stop engaging. I'm going to trust my judgment on this end of discussion. The people who matter will respect it, and you'll respect yourself more for honoring your own inner wisdom. So there you have it, 5 phrases that have fundamentally changed how I navigate the world and how the world responds to me. These aren't magic words, they're tools, and like any tool, they work best when you understand why you're using them and commit to using them consistently. What makes these phrases Stoic isn't just their origin, it's their underlying principle that you are the sovereign of your own mind, your own choices, your own reality. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. They all understood that respect isn't demanded through volume or aggression. It's commanded through calm, unshakable self-possession. If even one of these phrases resonated with you, I challenge you to use it this week, not practicing in front of a mirror, but in a real situation where you'd normally back down, people please, or get defensive, and pay attention to what happens. Not just externally, but internally. Notice how it feels to speak with that kind of quiet authority. Drop a comment below. Tell me which phrase you're going to try, or if you've used any of these, what happened. I read every comment, and I learn from your experiences too. This community is built on people who are tired of being walked over and ready to step into their power. If this video helped you, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to show this to others who need it. Subscribe if you want more content on practical Stoicism, modern philosophy and communication strategies that actually work, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear these phrases. Someone who's constantly accommodating, constantly explaining, constantly seeking permission to exist. Remember, the Stoics didn't write their philosophy to sound smart. They wrote it to survive chaos, to maintain dignity in impossible situations, and to live with integrity when everyone around them was compromising. These phrases are your armor in a world that constantly tries to make you smaller, quieter, more compliant. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. And remember, respect isn't given freely to those who beg for it. It flows naturally to those who respect themselves first. Now go use these phrases and watch what happens. See you in the next one. Stay sovereign.